Up next is a dear friend and an extraordinary individual. Her name is Emma Brandy. She's a community builder. She brings people together around shared interests in land mindfulness. This would include music, food, and shared interests around land-based identity. She's passionate about our food systems, and she brings fresh fruits and vegetables, eggs to the local community of the families and members of her immediate environments. She educates them about source, about the energy it takes to produce food, and to help them embrace the food roots of the place that we live in and how we are connected to those producers. Her most powerful experience in canoeing was at Camp Kearney, her very first multi-day trip as a junior leadership course. At 15, Emma first really understood this experience. It was really her first aha moment. She appreciates the opportunity that lake travel provides to explore her self-powered movement through these places. She next hopes to take a gentle paddle and hiking trip through Killarney, with me, I hope. And when I asked her, she said, "I believe canoeing is like moving meditation." A canoe trip journey, so she'll be presenting on a canoe trip journey that, in hindsight, has changed the trajectory of her life. It propelled her into her master's program. There, she was prompted to write about her personal experiences and turn these narratives into research form. It is through her research journey that Emma could then re-understand the culture of that canoe trip. Please help me welcome Emma.
This works. Forward, back. Awesome. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yippee. All right, so I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Erica, for the introduction. I'll try to stand just outside of here because I fear that you might not be able to see me because I'm so short. So I must admit, I've been here before, but not for the symposium. I've actually stood on that stage. I was probably in some sort of can-can outfit. It was for a dance recital, and I was 11, so it's exciting to be back and to be an adult here, sharing something that I'm really passionate about. So I must admit, I'm not really a recreational canoeist in the traditional sense of the term, nor am I an expert of the North, so you won't be hearing about high Arctic journeys from me. I'm also not your typical outdoor educator, instructor, or guide. I love canoeing and I cherish wilderness experiences, yet my time's not always filled, or my extra time is not always filled with outdoor adventure or teaching. Most of the time it's filled with phone calls, emails, personal things and exercise and some writing. So you're probably wondering how I fit in here. When I first spoke to Alex, I was actually kind of nervous. I don't know if he knows that. But with that nervous energy came the upswelling of inspiration around canoe journeys. Yay, it worked. I started telling him about how a specific canoe journey inspired me to leap across the Atlantic Ocean and in pursuit of my postgraduate learning, and how my research evolved into a poetic and literary investigation of myself. This investigation of self involved rigorous introspection as well as extensive extrospection. Yet it all came down to finding a way to articulate my life experience with academic elegance. I think this love of canoe journeys and a desire to understand them more deeply and share that with others is how I fit in here. So today I'd like to share with you stories of moments of inspiration from canoe journeys that have led me to this moment right now. I'd also like to offer you an introduction to a research approach that inspired me to share my story, and it continues to inspire me to this day. And so to tell these stories, I need to go back in time just a little bit. So I grew up in the east end of Toronto, not too far from here, and went to a small elementary school. And in grade 6, my teachers took me to the Scarborough Outdoor Education School, also known as Camp Kearney. If you don't know Kearney, it's located about 3.5 hours north. That's probably the only time you'll hear north in this session. It's located 3.5 hours north of Toronto on 400 hectares of pristine land. And after my school trip, I continued to go there as a camper. SOS became my second home, and it's located just north of Huntsville, quite close to Algonquin Park. So I became too old to be a camper, And so I transitioned to being a counselor. I just couldn't get enough of that place. And so over my time at Kearney, I learned the idea and practice of canoe tripping. And it's there that I learned my basic skills and taught others how to journey in the wilderness as well. We went on canoe trips to Mattawa, to Temagami, to the French River, and sometimes Algonquin Park. And so at that time, I didn't imagine that I would pursue a path where canoeing would constantly be my focus as well as my inspiration. At the time, I could have never foreseen myself standing here speaking to all of you. So I took a break from working at Kearney in 2009. It was the summer after my second year of school. I was studying kinesiology at McMaster in Hamilton. And my scientific brain was telling me that I had had enough of this summer identity. I thought of being at camp as only the summer self, that it couldn't be transitioned into the rest of the year. And so I stayed in Toronto and made a big decision to go on my first ever personal canoe trip with friends and family. Now, on this trip, I wasn't a camper, I wasn't a leader, I was just tripping, period. It kind of revolutionized my whole world because I felt refreshed and I felt this vigor and I felt free. So I went into my next year of schooling with this freshness and a new inspiration for outdoor experiences. I even decided in that year that I would take a course called Foundations of Outdoor and Experiential Education. These were all pretty new words to me at the time. And while the rest of my peers were delving deeper into the functions of the cardiac valves and studying the physiology of high-performance athletes, I started understanding that there could be a hidden curriculum in traditional schooling, or perhaps that experiential education in the outdoors could be a unique way to empower young people. So this course, I ate up all the material that my professor, Bob Henderson, who a lot of you probably know, I ate it all up. I felt giddy, I felt inspired, I was this new person beginning to form. So at the beginning of my final year of my undergrad, I took another course with Bob called, believe it or not, summer camp, and I was finally going back to summer camp, yes. So we embarked on a 5-day, I know, pretty short, 5-day loop in the Temagami region, and starting from Maskinonge Lake. And so only this time I was a participant, I wasn't a camper, I wasn't a leader, and I also wasn't on a personal trip with friends. There was something pretty unique that I felt about this journey, but I didn't know what it was. But I felt, once on that trip, I felt that familiar sense of community and freedom, and it evoked feelings of being at camp. But something in me changed. This canoe trip not only imprinted upon my identity, it seemed to shift the trajectory of my actions afterwards. The words heart song and passion crept into my awareness, and they were linked with this canoe journey. I felt so inspired and so impacted by this trip that I knew something was going to change once I got back home. And it did. So I got back to school and back to reality, and the spark didn't fade. I became increasingly motivated to learn more about outdoor education and to understand the essence behind this motivation. I was so inspired that out of the blue, I decided to approach Bob and ask him if he had any suggestions for how I could pursue postgraduate work in outdoor education. Now, I wasn't one of those people that ran to my professor's office hours all the time, so I was actually quite nervous because I also didn't really like talking to them about plans for my future. That was intimidating. So it was at this time that Bob let me in on what I believe to be one of the best kept secrets in the world. It's a master's program in outdoor education at the University of Edinburgh. I think I literally jumped out of my seat at this point because I was excited and totally afraid that if I applied, that I was going. So this conversation marked the beginning of what I think was the biggest personal journey of my life so far. I know I have a relatively short life so far, but it's the biggest one to this date. So that's me. Needless to say, I went to the University the University of Edinburgh and pursued my master's in 2011. I made that journey by boat as well, but wasn't quite like paddling a canoe. That's another story, you can ask me about it later. That involved 7 nights at sea with my mom, a lot of reading, some ballroom dancing, and a lot of ocean gazing. So at this point, I feel like I've given you a good picture of what sort of toolkit I had going to Scotland. My toolkit had some introductory theoretical knowledge in it and some years of experiential substance from canoeing in it. But I don't think anything could really prepare me for what sorts of learning opportunities I would be exposed to when in Scotland and what sorts of experiences I would be having. I know for sure that I could never have anticipated knowing that I was going to write my thesis on the story that I've just introduced you all to. So the process of getting to know my research method was a hairy one, but it was also a valuable one. Before entering my master's, I'd probably written under 10 academic papers in my life, most of them receiving these mediocre grades and lots of constructive feedback scribbled in the margins. I barely knew how to construct an argument, let alone come up with the entire concept and the questions to motivate that argument on my own. So as I approached my thesis proposal writing time, I kept thinking, what have I gotten myself into? I felt like that being there, that's me. I felt like my brain was being flipped upside down and that my awareness was hanging on for dear life. But during the brainstorming time, I often thought back to my canoe trip in Temagami. And I felt such relief. I felt this sense of knowing. I was reminded of the epiphany I experienced that September. I would marvel at the immense impulse I felt to pursue outdoor education after that trip. So I'd like to go back and say that the canoe trip in Temagami wasn't revolutionary in the sense that I had never experienced anything like it before, because I had. But along with this being only the second canoe trip in my adult life, the major difference was that I almost had this passive role on the trip. Like I said before, I wasn't a leader, I also wasn't a camper, but I wasn't responsible for leading the trip. It's like it took the pressure off. I could relax into it and experience. I'd also never been on a trip where the facilitator wove these stories and readings about history and geography so intentionally into the journey. For example, one day we stopped en route to a portage and Bob pulled out this pack of licorice cigars. And we're like, what is he doing? What is that? And it's in this way that I learned that the voyageurs used to measure the distance that they traveled and how many pipe breaks they took. So we then proceeded to pretend to be the voyageurs and took pictures of us, but I didn't want to expose you to those ridiculous things. So this canoe trip not only introduced me to new ways of knowing the waterways, it built upon my foundational understandings of outdoor and experiential education. I'd say this was my first conscious introduction to place-focused education. Now, I feel really lucky to be going after Kevin because he gave you a nice introduction to what place means, to what home means, to what we as a collective and also as individuals, how we relate to our landscape. So I think this follows quite nicely. But in Edinburgh, I knew that I wanted to explore these understandings from my trip in Temagami, but I didn't know how. And I didn't know if it was something that I could capture in research. And I didn't know if I was even allowed to talk about my personal experiences through research. Coming from this scientific background, I had very little understanding of research methods within the social sciences. And I certainly had no idea that one existed that would completely and utterly shift my perspective on research in general. This research method, as you saw in my title slide, is called autoethnography. Now, it's a bit of a ridiculous word, but if you don't know what it is already, that's totally okay, and I'm going to try and give you a slight introduction to it, and you're probably getting quite curious about it. And here's one definition that I like. Autoethnography is an autobiographical genre of writing and research that displays multiple layers of consciousness, connecting to the personal to the cultural. Now, that's a lot of words, and sometimes I find it easier to understand something when I know what it's not. It is not simply a confessional tale of self-renewal. It's a provocative weave of story and theory. So, autoethnography is both a process and a product. It's a method and a methodology. It has its roots in anthropology, as it evolved out of an idea that as researchers, we can immerse ourselves in a culture and get to know that culture. Autoethnography has more recently become a common method for understanding oneself as a reflection of culture and vice versa. It involves a blending of personal narratives with social literature that usually results in a written piece or a piece blending several art forms together. I was introduced to autoethnography by my supervisor, Robbie Nickel, who at the time was evaluating it as a tool to use in outdoor and environmental education, because I probably wouldn't have come to this thing on my own. I had no idea what it was. This is his citation, if you're interested in it. I can send it along to you afterwards. He suggested that I look into it because of my strong interest in investigating the potential within the canoe journey I was having. And when I started reading about autoethnography, I was actually surprised and really shocked to find that it was considered radical and that it was often chastised by the rest of the conventional research community. Hello. It was part of an approach that I wasn't sure if I could or even should tackle. But I also felt inspired. I felt excited to be this radical thinker and to become someone who would think outside of the box and advocate for the individual voice. So, with Robbie's encouragement, I did a lot of reading. I read book after book and journal after journal, as you do, and looking for ways that I can contribute my voice to the literature in outdoor education. So, through this process, I found that there was growing momentum in the social sciences and also in outdoor education to move beyond simply asking the question of whether our programs, whether these experiences in outdoor education work. I was starting to see some key thinkers moving towards understanding the individual process and experience from the participant perspective. This made so much sense to me. Why would we try to understand something that's process-oriented with an outcome-oriented approach? Like, why would we try to understand a canoe trip with an exam? Just doesn't make sense to me. Why would we try to deny the power that comes from making meaning from our experience? And why would we try to deny the power that the participant perspective has value and should be listened to? I was thrilled that I wasn't the only one beginning to think this way, and that others in my field were calling out for change. I was part of this community, let's say. So I started shifting the way I asked my research questions. Before I had all of these understandings, I had generated questions that had implicitly removed myself from the investigation. It's like I had just tried to say access denied to my own experiences. I was trying to be an unbiased researcher. There's a lot of talk about that, but because that's what I thought I had to do. But as I continued reading, I found this quote: "Why, if I am a variable in the outcome under investigation, should I exclude myself from the investigation?" This really shifted things for me, because can you really filter out your own experience, even if you wanted to? So I started to understand that telling my story through autoethnography would contribute to filling two gaps in the outdoor education literature. One, being that there's this lack of process-oriented and participant-focused research. And two, there's a lack of research surrounding place-important education. So not only was writing an autoethnography a way of responding to the literature's need to understand which places and which experiences have affected participants in a positive way, but it was also providing a piece of research that was both process-oriented and participant-focused. I felt like I had won the lottery. It's like, now, before you start thinking of me as this rogue autoethnographic rebel, I'd like to share with you a shift in thinking that was occurring in the social sciences when I was doing my master's. The style of research that I was endeavoring to do was part of something called a postmodern approach, where I, as the knower, could know something without claiming to know everything. I could look at that tree and think that it's beautiful and old without having to feel like I have to know everything about it. Also, this approach recognized that the language we use to convey knowledge is meaningful for the knower. So I could describe my experience of my time in Temagami and know that it was meaningful for me without having to know that it would be meaningful in the same way for everyone else. What also helped was that according to this postmodern approach, knowledge is socially constructed. So I could relax and understand that through writing about my experience, I was also writing about the social experience, the self as a mirror for the social, and vice versa. So, with great courage, I held up that mirror and began exploring my experiences of the canoe trip in light of the cultural dynamics that were at play. To start crafting my thesis, I looked back to my journal reflections from the trip in 2010, and I found passages that I could use as primary data. As a result of rereading these entries that I had written almost 2 years prior, new thoughts and new questions arose. I recorded these in a research journal, and these reflections were also woven into the manuscript to acknowledge the personal growth that occurred since the time in my canoe trip in 2010. They were also a way for me to create rich description of experience. And it would indicate that I was constantly mediating between myself and the world. And if I could create this rich description and put it into words, then others could potentially take it in. So I used the relevant literature, such as place-based theory, deep ecology, the Norwegian idea of friluftsliv, meaning open-air life, environmental philosophies, theories of transformation, and many more. I won't bore you, but to deepen my understanding of the experience in Temagami. This helped to continually relate my experience to the wider outdoor education context. This is an integral part of autoethnography. So the experience of writing the reflections on my journaling from 2010 gave me such great insight into a shift in my own identity, a shifting of self, or perhaps the understanding of a new part of my self that I hadn't known before. Revisiting these journal entries unearthed some significant themes from my time in Temagami. One was that I understood this deep connection to environment, or to place. And the second was that I realized the potential and transformative influence of canoe journeys, specifically this one canoe trip in Temagami. But not only did I realize these two major themes, I also realized this emerging environmental ethic that's still with me today. I recognize there is a deep ecological consciousness that connects me with the earth that I reside on and rely upon for my survival. And this ethic is part of an instinct that propels me into action. It's part of what drives me to be here talking to all of you today. So in the book, The Canoe in Canadian Cultures, James Raffin introduced me to the idea that the canoe is an instrument for knowing a river, and it's also an instrument for knowing the self. And I would like to go even further to say that for me, the canoe became a vehicle for transforming an identity, for creating awareness of a new aspect of my being. Through canoeing, writing, and autoethnography, I have had the privilege of getting to know a deeper and more contemplative aspect of myself. This, in many ways, has increased the complexity of my being, and in doing so, I have been able to understand myself as part of culture, as someone who both influences and is influenced by society. I think that's a good thing. But so what? You say, why tell this story? Why is it important? Well, for one, because I believe storytelling is a form of social action that inspires us to create community and connection. I also believe that stories travel with us through time, and that just like these standing stones on the Orkney Isles, stories act as teachers for the coming generations. Through autoethnography, I contribute my voice to a collective pool that is seeking to more deeply understand the nature of individual experiences in outdoor education. I contribute a story that will hopefully resonate with you on some level, and I hope that it will inspire action as well. To me, this story is also important because I work with others all the time. If I can understand myself more deeply, then I can understand how to be with others and my environment that I'm traveling through and with more respectfully and authentically. As an outdoor educator or an aspiring one, I see this as one of the most important parts of my practice. Not only do I have an impact on the place that I'm traveling through and connecting with, I also have an impact on the people that I'm with, and they on me, no matter how long or short of a time we have together. If I can spend time or more time being reflexive, I can become a more conscious practitioner. If I can help my participants do this too, they can become more conscious individuals as well. It is my hope that by sharing this, others may also feel inspired to derive deeper meaning from their own outdoor journeys and carry that into their practice, whatever that may be. So I'd like to leave you with one final piece. It's a personal reflection that I wrote for my thesis as I grappled with the transformation I was sensing within. It's also an example of how poetry can be woven into research. It's titled Lakes of Change. I went to them and ran into the water, ran until the water swallowed me whole. I filled my heart with translucent light and calmed my mind to stillness. The water sank deep into my skin. When I emerged, steeped in matter, my world appeared a changed shape. Wind-blown, sun-bleached, clearer. Branches of thought dance gracefully among the treetops of my mind, pulled by wind and song. Beads of clarity, strung together, growing evermore. Thank you.